Hi, my name is Elizabeth Wagner. I'm a textile designer and a hand weaver. Welcome to my channel, Illumination. Through these series of videos, I'd like to explain in absolute detail how the process of weaving works for the total beginner. You might be in a rural area or someplace where you don't have someone around you that weaves, or you don't have access to a mill or a fiber school that teaches weaving. And so I've designed these videos to take you step by step through the process. In my first couple of videos, I explained a little bit about yarn and also showed you the main parts of a floor loom. And this video I wanted to explain how I calculate a project. It's probably one of the most important steps because without it you won't know how much yarn to use or how to warp the loom. So I want to make a scarf, and that's the project that I've chosen for us to learn with. I want a 60-inch ladies scarf, and I've chosen two different yarns to make it with. In the warp, I've chosen an alpaca in brown, and in the weft, I've chosen this merino wool that I spun by hand myself. So the calculations, I'm going to just get started so you can see exactly how I figure out what I need. First I'll start with the warp. That would be this yarn. In my scarf, I'm just going to draw sort of a picture of a scarf here so you can get what I'm explaining. In my scarf, when I'm weaving it on the loom, I'm going to have all these pieces of yarn coming down. It's not very straight, but this will all be pieces of yarn, and I will be weaving back and forth to make the scarf. These long pieces that are stretched out on the loom are the warp, and each individual piece of yarn in the warp is called a warp end, or just an end. So what you have to do first of all is calculate according to whatever yarn you've chosen, and it doesn't have to be the same type that I've chosen. Some are chunkier, some are finer. This one's kind of a medium weight. What you have to do is figure out how many ends or warp pieces or pieces length of yarn you're going to need to make up your warp. First of all, you have to figure out how long you want the piece and how wide you want the piece. So when I finish the piece, I want it to be 60 inches long. I also want about 5 inches of fringe on each end. So, in addition to the 60 inches that I want my final piece to be and the 5 inches of fringe on each end, I'm going to add a little extra because when I take it off the loom, it's going to take up a little bit. It's going to relax and it's going to draw in a little bit. Also, when I finish the piece, I'm going to have to wash it. So it's going to shrink a little bit because we all know that wool shrinks to some degree. So usually for the take-up, I add about 10% of the length of the piece. So 10% of 60 is 6. So I'm going to add 6 inches for take-up, and I'm going to add another amount of yarn, 30 inches, that's going to wind up as waste. I'm not going to be able to weave every single inch of the warp that I have on the loom. Some of it's going to be cut off and I'm not going to be able to use it. It's going to be waste on the loom. And usually I add 30 inches of loom waste. So if you add all that together, I wind up with 106 inches total. So I want 106 inches of warp on my loom total to give me the piece that I want to wind up with. Now that's 106 inches, but we have to calculate how many yards that is. So if you divide by 36 for 36 inches in a yard, you get 2.94. So that's how many yards 106 inches is. So that's close enough to 3 yards. So I'm going to call it 3 yards. 3 yards, and that's for my warp. Now, I have to calculate how many ends I'm going to need in the warp across. And to do that, what they normally teach a beginner is to take a ruler and start wrapping the yarn that you're going to use in your warp around the ruler for about 1/2 inch. I'm starting at 4 and I'm wrapping. And the yarn needs to be very close to each other. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I'm going to wrap it for 1/2 inch. I've got it. It goes around 12 times. I have 12 wraps in 1/2 inch. So that's a good rule of thumb for how many inches or how many ends you'll need in an inch. So the warp is going to be 3 yards. I want 12 ends per inch. And I want the piece to be 9 inches. So 12 ends per inch times 9 inches is going to give me 108 total ends. 108 total ends. So now I have 108 ends, and each end needs to be 3 yards long. 108 ends times 3 yards is 324 yards. That's the warp. I need 324 yards for the entire warp. Usually for the weft, all I do is calculate about half. 324 divided by 2 is 162 yards. So I know that my warp is going to be 324 yards total. That's if you add up all of these 108 ends, and each one is 3 yards long, you're going to need 324 yards of yarn. And then when you weave back and forth, you're going to need 162 yards of the weft yarn. If you're all doing it in the same exact yarn, if I was using all of this for the warp and the weft, I would then need 486 yards total. But I'm going to need 324 yards of the brown, and I need 162 yards of the weft yarn, the multicolored yarn that I've got. And that's a total of 486 yards. So on my next video, I'm going to explain to you how to measure the warp. And hopefully you've understood this, because sometimes it can be confusing. But I will measure the warp in the next video, and then we'll get started warping the loom on the following video. Thank you so much for watching, and stick with me, and pretty soon we'll be weaving.